Welcome to the special study session for the City Council on May 13th, 2024. Madam City Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Fears.
Here.
Councilmember Perkins.
Here.
Councilmember Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember McCandless.
Here.
Councilmember Wiley.
Here.
Councilmember Vaught.
Here.
Mayor Rowland.
Here. And to correct that, it is a special City Council meeting, not a special study session. So thank you for correcting that on the record. Also, if you can, Madam City Clerk, please read the first bill.
24-040, first reading, an ordinance imposing a police sales tax at the rate of 1/4 of 1% of the receipts from the sale at retail of all tangible personal property or taxable services at retail within the City of Independence, Missouri, which shall remain in effect at said rate thereafter until repealed by the voters of the city, calling for the proposition adopting said tax to be placed on the ballot at the regularly scheduled election to be held August 6th, 2024, proposing the form of the ballots and directing the city clerk to do all things called for by law in connection with the holding of said election. First reading.
Thank you. And Mr. City Manager, I believe you've got a presentation for us.
I do, sir. Given the quick nature in which this came together, we thought it would be helpful as staff to enlighten the council and your constituents further about the ordinance that the clerk just read.
Please proceed.
Be happy to do so. So again, thank you, Mayor and Council, for making time for this special meeting tonight. Tonight, we want to talk to you about the status of our Independence Police Department. As you all know, this was the year that our collective bargaining agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 1 was set to expire. So I want to talk to you about that contract negotiation, but also want to talk to you about an issue that's come to light during the course of these negotiations that have substantially altered the nature of those negotiations, the financial impact that is having on the city, share with you an idea we have about how to address this financial issue, and then of course make room for any questions the council has. So the current contract between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police is set to expire June 30th of this year. However, through very collaborative process, the parties have tentatively agreed to a new agreement. Later this week, the Lodge 1 will be voting on that agreement as whether or not to accept that on their end, and then pending their approval, that will come to the council next Monday night in the form of a resolution for council consideration. Sometimes when we get into these contract negotiations, we're looking at language about the rules or about how departments operate. This year, this issue for this contract really came down to one major topic, and that was wages, making sure we stayed competitive in today's environment for what it costs to pay for a police department. With the voter approval a few years ago to amend Proposition P, we were able to substantially alter our wage table for our members of our police department. And other departments have made similar moves, and we thought going into this contract we were going to have a little pencil sharpening to do, but nothing that wasn't unanticipated to make sure we stayed within this competitive realm. But unfortunately, earlier this year, the city of Kansas City, Missouri adopted a new wage scale for their police department. Now I say unfortunately, Kansas City's our neighbor. They border a significant portion of Western Independence. It's certainly benefits us if they are addressing their issues of crime and disorder in their community. But the challenge is their wage scale substantially altered the market for a member of a police department, particularly here in the Kansas City metropolitan area. And you compare that to the decision that was made about 18 months ago to lift the residency requirement for members of the police department such that they could live anywhere within a 30-mile radius of the police headquarters. And I'll show you what that looks like in my next slide. But this issue hasn't now just been limited to Kansas City. Since this wage table was adopted by the Kansas City Board of Police Commissioners, the city of Riverside, population 4,013, has now adopted a wage table that surpasses Kansas City, Missouri. They said, we're not going to lose our officers across the city limits. They took action. And of course, we have good working relationships with all of our peer cities, and we've already heard Lee Summit and Blue Springs, along with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, are already beginning to have preliminary conversations with their staff and memberships about what they may need to do to take action so that they're not at risk of losing officers. This is that radius that I showed you, 30 miles. Maybe doesn't sound like that much, but when you look at this, you can see you're as far south as nearly Harrisonville, stretching east and west, of course. I can assure you that the vast majority of your Independence Police Department personnel live somewhere within this shaded area. So the opportunity to not have to relocate your family into Kansas City, that barrier is gone for us now. The other barrier is now the pay-wage gap that has been widened. Kansas City, Missouri, over a period of years now, 20 years in this example, if you were an officer in that department, you would make $600,000 more than what you'd make as an Independence Police Department officer, $579,000 specifically. And the other caveat here is that the Kansas City Police Department has lifted the amount of years it takes to get to the top of the range, such that it only takes 9 years to get there now. 9 years and you have reached the top of their pay range. Here in Independence, that takes 20 years, so that's why I showed you the 20-year example. But that's a little misleading, because after 9 years, you're able to top out your pay as a police officer in Kansas City. Sergeants are also members of the bargaining unit. You can see in their wage table, which tops out at 9 years for sergeants, as does an Independence police officer, but their top out pay compared to ours after 9 years, you would have made $161,000 more working as a sergeant over 9 years in Kansas City than you would here in Independence. So that total cost, if we wanted to match Kansas City dollar for dollar, would cost us $6.8 million just to match their wage scale. Okay, cumulatively for all the positions and dollar to dollar, we would need to generate an extra $6.8 million to match for our police personnel what's now happened for Kansas City. For here, for Independence. Well, maybe you ask yourself, why do I care about this? Well, Independence, Missouri has 230 sworn positions. And of those positions, 38 of those are vacant positions. And in talking to Chief Dustman, if we were to lose just an additional 10 to 12 officers, our staffing levels would be such that we would have to start to move people away from some of our specialized units, which I'll show you what those look like later in this presentation, and move them to patrol, just so we have people doing the basic frontline patrol work. Recruiting is going to become even more challenging than it already is. The other day on May 1st, we had 12 individuals signed up to come test to be an IPD officer, and of those 12, two people showed up to take the test that day. And you compare that to Kansas City, that since May 1st, just a couple days ago, they've already had 44 certified applicants apply to be an officer in Kansas City. These aren't folks that have to go to the academy. These are people that already have the necessary certifications, and they can go to work right away for the department. The specialized assignments that I mentioned to you, and certainly if you want to have more discussion about this, we could, but the special tactics unit, that would be things like your motorcycle unit, your accident investigation team, the K-9 unit, and of course the SWAT units. The community engagement unit, community services, which I know of importance to this council, the team that does our homeless outreach services, those would be our school resource officers, and our crisis intervention team members that provide the mental health services to people in distress. Criminal investigation units, crimes involving property, persons, sex, and guns. The special investigations unit, the drug enforcement unit, the Kansas City Career Criminal Unit, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the Jackson County Joint Drug Task Force. Of course, our Professional Standards Unit, which does internal affairs and all the departmental training and certifications, and our folks who serve in the public information office in the police department. These are where Chief Dustman would have to start to look to pull people to fill the vacancies in patrol should we lose just another 10 to 12 positions. As a citizen, you've probably made clear, most recently in the citizen survey, that this is an issue for you. I did a keyword search of the open-ended comments section of the citizen survey. The word police was found 69 times. The word crime popped up 30 times. Police services are ranked second among the city services that residents thought are the most important to emphasize over the next 2 years. And of the public safety services, their priorities are the city's effort to prevent crime, the police presence in their neighborhood, and the police presence in commercial areas. So clearly you can see police is a priority for the residents. So we got this issue, and we hopefully now understand better how it impacts us. As management, we sat down with leadership in the Fraternal Order of Police and began working on a solution. Your FOP leadership has been excellent to work with on this. They understand not only the magnitude of the issue, but what that $6.8 million match to Kansas City would look like and how challenging we would have it to try to match that. So they have worked very collaboratively and professionally with us to try to identify a workable solution. And we think we have one. And we'll find out when they vote later this week and you vote next Monday night. But sharing what's tentatively been agreed to. We have agreed to provide biannual step increases, so meaning every other year, with a 1% increase on top of that to the proposed salary schedule for each step. It also lowers that top-out time from 20 years down to 16 years, so makes it faster to try to get to the top of the scale. Sergeants are going to start at 5% over the highest master police officer, and they will get a 2% increase every third year. So in years 3, 6, and 9, they'll get an increase in there as well. Command staff, they're going to keep their current steps, but because of wage compression issues, we'll be looking at their salaries as well in there, because you certainly don't want to have subordinate employees making more than the people that they supervise, or that are supervised by them, pardon me. Okay, so the pay scale scenarios here, so you can just kind of get a quick glance at what this looks like compared to Kansas City. Entry-level salary, we are now, under this proposed agreement, only $3,000 less than the proposed starting salary for a Kansas City officer. Jumping ahead to year 8, we would only be $20,000 apart, again, because they're topping out at 9 years, so those years are a little bit more aggressive, but by year 16, you're only $3,600 apart. And then sergeants, again, only $1,100 apart when you start, and by year 9, only $121 total difference between your pay and the top-end pay for a sergeant in Kansas City. So comparing just total, we have narrowed the gap for a police officer in Kansas City to independents by $367,000, and for a sergeant, we closed that gap by $132,000. So instead of making $579,000 left over the course of this career, you'd make $211,000 less. Sergeants would make $29,000 less. So again, we're not matching dollar for dollar, but we're being aggressive to try to close both the year-to-year pay as well as how aggressively somebody reaches the top end of their wage schedule. So talking about how much does it cost? In our agreement with the FOP, we have agreed to phase this in over a 2-year period. You'll see why that's important here in just a moment, but year 1 would be $1.9 million to introduce this plan, and year 2 would mean an additional $1.6 million. So about a total of $3.6 million total over a 2-year period would be needed. Now, there's a critical caveat to all of this that the council and the community need to understand, and that is these wages right here reflect the funding for the vacant, or the filled positions. Our thought is we need to draw a line in the sand and make sure we're not losing anybody, or if we do lose somebody, we are able to very quickly backfill them with competitive wages compared to Kansas City and the other jurisdictions around us. Those 38 vacancies at a starting salary of $62,000 would mean we'd need to generate an extra $3.2 million. That is part of our formula here and our solution that you'll see in a minute, but just wanted you to know that the plan that you're agreeing to theoretically next Monday night does not include the funding for the adjusted salaries for those 38 vacant positions. The budget contemplates those 38 positions there, but not the increased funding for the difference in starting salary. So how do we pay for this? Well, as you saw in my budget presentation earlier this evening, the general fund would be a natural first place to look. It's certainly the most diverse fund in the city, has the least amount of restrictions on it. Unfortunately, this budget, as I mentioned earlier, has a $4.3 million shortfall associated with it. So just to get back to even, to keep doing what we're doing and meet our constitutional mandate for a balanced budget, we had to go cut $4.3 million out of the general fund budget this year. There were other pressures in there. As I mentioned earlier tonight, we needed to increase the fire overtime. We wanted to provide that wage increase for all of our employees. We needed to make sure we accounted for the loss of the federal transit dollars for public transit. So we do have a balanced budget, as you saw earlier this evening, with a net savings of $600,000. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you had to cut 4.3 and then try to find more, 600,000 was a pretty good start getting down the road this year. But it's not $3.5 million now, is it? So maybe it's, well, let's just not do something else in the general fund. Well, the general fund is really, as you saw, a department or a budget of people and public safety, depending on which category you're looking at. Salaries, benefits, overtime, the retiree insurance program, all that cumulatively is 96% of the general fund budget, which just leaves 4% left over for things like operating expenses, equipment purchases, or debt service. And then, of course, by department, 45% to police or 31% to fire. Cut all these other city departments in the general fund in, totality, and still would not be able to generate all of the dollars that you would need on a substantial ongoing basis to meet this need. So you're looking at, am I cutting public safety to fund public safety, or am I going to start cutting people and services from other places in the general fund? We did not feel like that was a viable option to bring to the council. There's certainly other funding sources out there, but all of those have their own issues. The public safety sales tax, that is limited to equipment only by nature of the ballot language, so that's not going to pay for salaries. The use tax, couple of interesting things there. The use tax initially was intended to fund 30 sworn positions, and then the amendment to that allowed that to be used for salary and benefit growth, the competition that I alluded to earlier, as well as equipment purchases. So this year, the ERP charges that I was talking about, that's cybersecurity, the prevention of ransomware attacks, things of that nature. That this year alone is a $1.3 million cost in the use tax fund. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but I was talking to somebody in the Kansas City Fire Department today who is not able to check email, isn't sure if they're going to be able to run payroll this Friday because they are subject to a ransomware attack. And as Councilmember Stewart has told me many times, you can pay your $1.3 million today or tenfold later after you've been hacked. So there's the story with that. This year is paying for the Axon contract. That is all the technology upgrades, the front line of that being the body cameras for 200 plus officers in the department, other technology upgrades as well, but obviously body cameras was one of the high profile issues there. Revenue growth in the use tax this year is only $200,000. Now that's great, but it's not $3.5 million now, is it? The rest of that fund balance this year is being used to help pay for that Justice Center design contract in concert with the marijuana sales tax. So as that fund starts to ramp up, there'll be more dollars for things like that, but we need to combine that this year with the use tax to help pay for those services. And then, of course, the marijuana sales tax being used to pay for the Justice Center design this year. But even if it reaches what we think it is of $900,000, well, that's not $3.5 million now, is it? So there is an option of utilizing one-time resources. We have remaining total in the budget $930,000 of those ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Those have to be spent by the end of this year. By December 31 of '24, those have to be spent. 232 of that $930,000 are already allocated to police-related purposes. That $930,000 is what we as staff believe could be appropriately transferred from other projects that either have leftover funds or for whatever reason aren't going to materialize, and we could apply that amount towards that. We could also use fund balance for this year. Fund balance, by its definition, is to be used for an emergency, and this certainly feels like an emergency this year. So it solves the immediate crisis, but ARPA monies will be gone once we spend them, and fund balance, every year you spend down and don't add, you're only going to get further away to the point you would fully deplete it. So without a permanent solution, we'll be standing right back in front of you next year having this same conversation. This quickly is that ARPA fund that I was talking to you about. So where you can see we as staff have went and evaluated what is either left over from projects that were approved by council or projects that for whatever reason aren't going to materialize. This is how we got to that $930,000. This would require council action to approve an amendment to the spending plan, but this is a viable option for a one-time solution. So the year one plan, we need $1.9 million to fund that this year. We have those general fund savings from balancing our budget and going a little further of a little over $600,000. The ARPA monies of $929,000, which would leave an amount of about $370,000 that we would need to pull down from our general fund reserves to pay for this plan this year. So this would give us the ability to approve that plan and buy us time to figure out a permanent solution while paying for our obligations and commitments to the police department this year. It's year two where things start to fall apart. That's when you not only have the $1.9 million obligation from year one, but now the 1.7 from year two. You're still able to bring forward the $600,000 of general fund savings that we have this year. And if you'll recall from my presentation earlier tonight, the amount of savings from the elimination of the Open Access Plan 1 will have a full year impact next year, which means an additional $685,000 would come onto the table for the general fund, and that could be applied to this too, which would leave you a shortfall of about $2.3 million that you're trying to close. So having looked at all of the funding sources we have, having looked at our expenses, our recommendation to the council is to pursue a new funding source, one that is permanent, ongoing, sustainable in nature, and matches ongoing dollars to this ongoing commitment. Under Missouri state law, the city already assesses a 1% local option sales tax, and local option means just that. You as local leaders have the option to decide how those funds are spent. Today, that money flows into the general fund, and we allocate it to meet all the different needs for services that are housed and budgeted within the general fund. Back in 2017, a cap was put on this particular tax at a rate of 2%, which, as independents, left us with a 1% ceiling with which end to potentially work. We believe, having calculated the impact of the current 1% local option tax, that your best option to pay for this is a 1/4 cent increase, which would be about $5.5 million. So applying that math, and if you threw on those 38 vacant positions I referenced, you'd be short about $5,000, and we just won't send Mitch to an extra conference next year. I don't know, we'll figure it out. But $5,000 is a lot better than $3.6 million. So this would allow you to fully fund your obligations for all of your positions in the police department and to have the wage table that will compete with Kansas City. So again, just as a summary, bringing in that quarter-cent tax will help solve this budgetary challenge that's been thrust upon us this year. We recommend pursuing this as soon as possible, which would be the August 6th election, so that we have plenty of time to make sure that this tax is not only put before the voters, but then we have the appropriate time to notify the Department of Revenue and then begin collecting the tax so that we have the dollars to plan our budget when we find ourselves here a year from now. There are a couple of other quick questions that I've picked up on, and I'm sure there are others as well that will come, but the ones we've heard, we just wanted to try to touch on briefly. It's been asked if this will in any way adversely impact the waterfall of Proposition P. The lighter blue color on the left is what that waterfall amount looks like today. So $893,000 under Prop P is what's required to satisfy the animal services portion of that requirement. About $4.7 million is what's required to satisfy the police portion. Once those two obligations have been met, each of the taxes collects their percentage based on whatever has been approved by the voters. Under the new plan, the only thing that changes is an extra quarter-cent flows to the general fund. So in essence, water is still coming out of the tap, it's just coming at a faster rate. Because you'll be collecting more in total sales tax, theoretically, the animal services and police requirement will be filled faster, which means these other funds will start to receive their portion of the waterfall sooner in the year. So this should be a positive benefit to all the sales tax funds. We're also asked, how does our tax rate compare to the city? And I would encourage you to spend some time looking at this as you're a council member or a resident, because I know there's a lot of information here. But the point I want to make with this is that when you compare us to cities, both in terms of population or in terms of cities that we are directly competing for right now for economic development deals, remember we were talking about North Point earlier, we grabbed some of these cities specifically to illustrate to you where our sales tax rate stands, what our tax levy rate is, as well as our assessed valuation, so how much that's being applied against. And I know I spoke to this during the budget to Councilmember Wiley. On average, Independence has a lower sales tax rate, a lower tax levy rate, and a much lower assessed valuation against which to apply that tax rate. So we don't have the resources that our other cities do to pull this money out of our pockets. That is why we believe that introducing another funding mechanism is important if you believe that retaining these officers is important. So with that, that's the presentation, and I'm happy to stand for questions. And the chief is here as well if you have questions specific of him.
Thank you. Any questions from any council members? Any questions for the chief or city manager? Mr. Walker, I have this question, and this may be something that you and the chief can look up on. What are the number of calls that we have for service compared to other cities? And I know you may not have that information right now, but before the next council meeting, if we could get that to get a comparison,
Yep, we could look that up for you.
That'd be absolutely
Yep,
terrific. And
okay.
I'm thrilled that you discussed the waterfall question because I had a couple of calls on that today. So I'm glad you had that prepared and ready to go.
Certainly.
With that, though, anyone else other questions? Please proceed.
Mr. Walker, if you could you speak to a little bit of what your concerns are relative to, I know you talked a little bit about if we weren't able to provide, some sort of a improved scenario and that would let us better compete with Kansas City. You spoke to that a little bit, but what happens if we lose 20 officers, or, I mean, because what you're really talking about, if I understand it correctly, is that we would have, likely have officers move from Independence to Kansas City where they can make a whole lot more money. So, obviously, that's detrimental to our department, detrimental to, our city. Can you speak to a little bit of concerns of what the gravity of that might be?
Yes, and I think we got just a small sampling of that a few years ago when our staffing levels were reaching some of those critical points, and the chief had to suspend promotional opportunities into those specialized units. Patrol is obviously a very fundamental and basic and critical part of any police department. It's the thing that we all see most visibly as residents or business owners in the community. It's the folks that are, on scene first when those calls for service go out. And because of that critical nature, when you start to reach those critical staffing levels, and even going deeper into what you were speaking to, council member, the chief is left in a position where he's either not filling those spots in those specialized units, and or he's transferring people back to patrol. And that's more than just it was fun to be on the SWAT team. These specialized units, one, are kind of what make the police department Independence what it is. It's been an opportunity for us to say that if you come to Independence, you get to do some of this more involved police work. And I can tell you in my conversations with the chief and the president of the lodge, that can have a very adverse impact on morale and have an even more negative impact of people that say, I'm 15 years into this job. I really don't want to do patrol. I would rather go somewhere else where I can do some of this more challenging or advanced work, if you will. But it also has that adverse impact on the community. I mean, right now, unfortunately, as too many of our people know, our staffing levels don't always allow us to get to every call. People who either have experienced some kind of a property crime or, are feeling some sort of, safety issue, but, there's not an immediate threat. Police are in a difficult position as it is trying to prioritize these calls for service. So I think your citizen frustration is probably going to increase, but then these specialized units bring a level of advanced response and professionalism to your department. So by not filling those, you're only going to continue to weaken your capabilities, your strategic operations, and your tactical abilities. You're just going to see an overall decline in morale, in community response, and in the quality of the kind of response we can provide.
Thank you. Yes, please proceed.
Mr. City Manager, you may have mentioned this, but I don't recall. How big a hole is Kansas City trying to fill? How many officers are they down, to give an idea of the scope of the problem? Yeah,
so Kansas City has approximately 1,700 authorized positions, and 400 of those are vacant. In our conversations with them, when they were at 200, that was an inconvenience. When they were at 300, that got their attention. When they got to 400, it became critical, and they felt an immediate and swift and noticeable action was necessary to start to fill those positions. So it is a pretty significant hole at 400 that they are trying to plug.
So they're going to be highly motivated to harvest officers out of all the surrounding municipalities. And so this isn't just going to be a right now problem. This is going to be recruitment for all of the replacement officers into the future as we have scheduled retirement. So this has multi-year impact for us. And we're already facing some budgetary challenges. To load this on top of that without the sales tax, I think would be an insurmountable burden. My little outburst earlier was per year, the idea that this isn't a one-time fix. We're gonna have to make this adjustment across our budget for time into the future.
Yes.
So I appreciate bringing this solution forward. It is always a hard decision for me to increase the costs for people who live paycheck to paycheck because they pay the most in sales tax. That burden rests heavily on them, but I think it's such a dire situation that we really don't have any choice. So I'll be strongly in favor of getting this going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Anyone else?
Mr.
Please
Mayor.
proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. This is definitely a sense of urgency. I don't know if I've sat through too many council meetings where we've been more engaged in a contract discussion than this one before, particularly with the outside forces that have been brought upon us by Kansas City. Coming off the election cycle, as three other of my colleagues have done. So please in the neighborhood policing, in their mind, they're out mowing the yard or picking up trash or playing with the kids. They see a cruiser go by the house. They'd like to see more of that, more response times, better response times. Stuff that I had heard at the door definitely lends to the satisfaction survey that you're referring to and that I read. So thank you for putting this together. Thank you for the FOP for working with management to get this done as quickly as they have. That's another first for my career, is to have an agreement that is put together, then will be shortly ratified, I hope, by their membership. The tax burden that would be proposed to our citizens and placed on the ballot, the outside of the tax burden won't all fall on the citizens. We will have a lot of people that are paying that tax regardless when they come into the city, purchase items, go to the restaurants, tourism, all of that. Do you know what kind of percentage split that is?
It's been a few years since we specifically updated that, but the last time we performed an analysis of that, the local sales tax, not the transient guest tax, of course, but just that local tax that's paid on any of your purchases in the community, was about 40% transient, somebody from outside of town. But again, that's been a few years, so I would suspect that number is probably conservative at this point.
Talking about numbers, the base pay that you're referring to with Kansas City, that's no overtime. That's just walking in the door. That's your starting salary.
Yeah,
correct?
you're going to walk in the door in Kansas City and make $62,000 a year.
Okay. Well, thank you for putting this together. Short notice. That's all I have. I'll defer my comments until next week.
Thank you. Anyone else? Other questions, concerns, comments? Anything else? Okay. And with that actually concludes it because we've done the first reading. This is preparing for our second reading next week.
Yes,
That's
sir.
why we did the emergency meeting here today.
Yes, sir.
And I think with that, we can call this meeting concluded.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.